The ticking clock was the loudest sound in the apartment. Aarav sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the empty coffee cup in his hands. It had been 3 days since he spoke to anyone. 3 days since his phone rang with a familiar voice on the other end. The city outside his window buzzed with life. Cars honking, street vendors calling out their deals, people laughing over evening tea. But inside his apartment, there was only silence. Loneliness wasn't new to Aarav. It had crept into his life like a shadow, slowly, unnoticed, until one day it became all he could see. Aarav had always been surrounded by people, friends, colleagues, family, until one by one, life pulled them away. His college friends moved abroad. His colleagues had their own families to go home to. His parents, once his emotional anchors, now lived in another city, their calls becoming shorter, filled with polite check-ins rather than real conversations. Even at work, he was just another face in the crowd. Small talk in the pantry, a nod in the hallway, a forwarded email, no real connections. But what truly made loneliness unbearable was that it wasn't always obvious. It wasn't just sitting alone on a weekend. It was being in a room full of people and still feeling invisible. One evening, Aarav found himself staring at the neighbor across the street. She was an elderly woman, sitting on her tiny balcony, sipping tea. Every night, she sat there alone, watching the world go by. For the first time, Aarav wondered, does she feel lonely too? And then an odd realization struck him. What if everyone felt like this? But no one spoke about it. The thought lingered in his mind, unsettling yet comforting. The next evening, after an exhausting day at work, Aarav sat on his own balcony, mirroring the woman across the street. This time, their eyes met. She smiled. He hesitated, then smiled back. A moment later, she lifted her teacup slightly in his direction, as if toasting him. Without thinking, Aarav raised his coffee mug in return. And just like that, for the first time in weeks, he felt seen. That night, something inside him shifted. The next morning, instead of walking straight to his desk at work, he stopped at the coffee machine where a colleague, Samir, was stirring his tea. "Morning," Aarav said. Samir looked up, surprised. "Hey, morning." Aarav hesitated, then added, "You always bring homemade lunch, right? Is it any good?" Samir grinned. "The best. Want to try?" And just like that, lunch wasn't lonely anymore. Days turned into weeks, and Aarav started noticing the small connections he had been ignoring. The security guard at his building, who always nodded at him. The barista at his usual cafe, who knew his order by heart. The old woman across the street, who now waved every evening. Loneliness wasn't about having no one around. It was about not acknowledging the people who were already there. One evening, as Aarav sipped his coffee on the balcony, he saw the elderly woman struggling with a potted plant. Without thinking, he crossed the street and knocked on her door. She opened it, surprised. "Oh, hello." Aarav smiled. "Need some help with that plant?" She laughed. "That obvious, huh?" As he lifted the heavy pot and placed it where she wanted, she said, "You know, I used to have a garden back in my hometown. My late husband and I, we spent hours tending to it." Aarav listened, really listened. And as she spoke, he realized loneliness wasn't always about being alone. Sometimes it was about not having someone to share your stories with. That night, Aarav lay in bed, his apartment still quiet. But this silence felt different. It wasn't empty. It wasn't unbearable. It was simply peaceful. Moral of the story: loneliness isn't always about having no one. It's about not noticing the connections that already exist. Sometimes all it takes is a simple smile, a small conversation, or the willingness to listen.